As the first black woman police chief in the history of Orlando, Florida, Congresswoman Val Demings is gaining momentum as the person Joe Biden could possibly pick for his ticket as vice president. And now she joins us from Florida. And we've just been talking about all kinds of things, but want to say welcome to The View. Welcome to The View. So
thank you. It's great to be back
on a short list. Excellent. You're on a short list as possible running mate for Joe Biden. Why in the world would you want this job?
You know, that is an extremely good question. I ask myself that every day. But Whoopi, I got to tell you, sometimes you don't choose the situation. Sometimes the situation chooses you. And I do believe this is one of those moments. As you all know, I started out as a social worker right out of college, working with broken families and broken children. I then went on to join the Orlando Police Department, spent 27 years there, rose through the ranks to become the first woman chief of police. I enforced the laws, and now I'm in Congress where I write the laws. I've worked at every level of government. We find ourselves dealing with police misconduct, discrimination, and social injustices. I've dealt with those issues inside the police department and outside of the police department. I believe I have the on-the-ground experience, the credibility, and the political will and courage to get this done. Imagine having a president who was committed to these issues. We know that discrimination and racism has been the ghost in the room for over 400 years. But imagine having a president who is really committed to dealing with it. And I look forward to, I don't know what Joe Biden is going to do, whether I'm selected or not. I will continue to work with him once he's elected to make sure that we send a strong message that, look, you can be a racist if you want to. You just shouldn't be in the police department. You shouldn't be an educator. You shouldn't decide who gets housing. You shouldn't decide who gets jobs and wages. And we have a lot of work to do in this country, but I'm looking forward to being a part of that.
Well, I wish you good luck. I hope it's true, Congresswoman. But let me ask you this. Before you worked in Congress, you were the first woman to be named chief of the Orlando Police Department, as Whoopi said. So when you watch the George Floyd video of his death and hear George's brother tell lawmakers to make sure his brother didn't die in vain, what goes through your mind, and what are you prepared to do to make sure that he doesn't die in vain?
Joy, I listened to George Floyd's brother testify in person last week. And to listen to his story, I mean, we've all heard it, but to sit there listening to him and asking us as lawmakers to do our jobs and make sure his brother did not die in vain, I am totally committed to making sure of that. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus under the leadership of Karen Bass, but for decades has been working on criminal justice reform along with the Judiciary Committee. We need to, when I see things go wrong, just like when I did at the police department, there were either one of three things: bad mind, which you don't need to be a cop; bad heart, you're a racist; or bad policy. We need to look at our policies and change them. What we need to make sure is that we hire the brightest and the best, people who have the right stuff and what it takes, has a good mind, but also a good heart for the job. We need to hire diversity because police departments need to reflect the diversity in the communities in which they serve. We all know, and we're painfully reminded yet again this past weekend, that we need to look at training and give officers clear options, certainly focusing on de-escalation training, whether it is a 10-person police department or a 36,000-person police department. We need to look at who's training officers. Remember, the training officer is the person who sets the standard for what's acceptable and unacceptable on the street. So we need to look at who's doing the training. And then we need to continue to try to build trust with the community, which means we need to have regular contact with the community in which, or the police need to have regular contact with the community in which they serve. And so while I believe the federal government has a major role to play in setting some standards and guidelines, I also called on each law enforcement agency. I made a public appeal to start looking within and change those policies that you can change now. You don't have to wait until we're able to get this bill, the Justice and Policing Act, through the House and through the Senate. You can look at your policies right now and change them right now, starting with banning chokeholds or neck restraints.
Congresswoman, just this past weekend in Atlanta, Rayshard Brooks died after a white police officer shot him. It prompting the resignation of the city's police chief and more protests. How did this go from a calm, rational conversation to a man now being dead? A USA Today investigation has found over the past decade, 85,000 law enforcement officers have been investigated or disciplined for misconduct. You're obviously a former police chief. What do you think needs to change?
Well, first of all, my thoughts and prayers go out to Mr. Brooks's family. And as we saw from the video this weekend, things can change in the twinkling of an eye, which requires law enforcement officers to have to make split-second decisions. But the question that law enforcement agencies have to ask themselves, and certainly the public is asking as well, was the use of deadly force the only option that the officer had? Now, we saw them rolling around. There was an all-out fight on the ground. We saw Mr. Brooks break free and run with the taser. But was the use of deadly force the only option that the officer had? And based on my 27 years of law enforcement experience, being an officer on the street, but also supervising and managing officers through the chain of command, I do not believe that the use of deadly force was the only option that this officer had. Mr. Brooks was fleeing from the situation. We know that he wasn't in possession of a firearm or anything that would cause death or great bodily harm to citizens that would threaten them in any way. We also know that the officers had already gotten his identification. They knew who he was. They knew where he lived. They were in possession of his car. They could have tracked him down or even cordoned the area that night and prevented him from fleeing the scene. But they certainly knew who he was and could have tracked him down. And so, you know, it's about police agencies looking at their training and ensuring that officers clearly understand when the use of deadly force is their only option. In this case,
Sonny?
I don't believe
Sonny?
it was.
Sorry? Oh, tease.
Do we have
What?
time, Whoop?
I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, do it, girl.
Okay, sure. There is a debate, Congresswoman, over what police reform should look like. And the former vice president rejected calls to defund police, basically diverting funds, saying federal aid to police should be based on meeting basic standards of decency. But police reform, which in my mind is changing protocols, implicit bias training, body cameras, the type of training that you just discussed, hasn't really stopped the disproportionate arrests, use of force, killing of Black people in the community. As a potential running mate, do you think Biden's plan falls short of addressing the problem here?
No, I think the vice president is absolutely correct. And, you know, one of the things that I clearly understand, I patrolled the African-American community the entire time that I was assigned to the streets of Orlando. And so I think what many people forget is that Black communities want safe communities as well. And when you're in law enforcement, you have a direct responsibility to make sure that they are receiving the level of service from the police department to keep them safe as any other community. I know that there are many out there that are trying to make this an us versus them situation, like we have to choose between the police and social services. That is not the case. What we are saying, and I think former Chief David Brown of Dallas, Texas said it best, He said that every time there is a society failure, we call the police to handle it. Not enough mental health funding? Give it to the cops. Education fails? Call the cops to settle it. When did we start calling police officers when a child in the classroom would not give up their phone or won't sit down or leave the classroom? He also went on to say, if there's not enough drug addiction funding, don't worry about it, give it to the cops. We say here in Orange County that the Orange County Jail is the biggest mental health facility and the biggest drug treatment facility in the region. Police officers were never trained or designed to deal with that. They've received some training. But what about as we fund the police department to make sure that every community has an appropriate level of service and police response, let's make investment into some of those social ills that cause decay in communities in the first place, like homelessness, lack of jobs, substandard housing, substandard education, healthcare. We're in the middle of a public health pandemic. So we don't have to make a choice either or here. Let's appropriately fund communities as they should be.